Great, hi, thanks very much. Like Ewa and Nigel, to do this kind of work, like the projects they've talked about, you need to kind of be in a little bit of a sort of interdisciplinary place. I think what's nice about work around sensors is that it does span the technical and the social in some really interesting ways. I work, I just said I work in Stockholm. I help to run this Mobile Life Research Centre. And there we're about 1/3 social scientists, 1/3 computer scientists, and about 1/3 designers. And this, I think, makes for a slightly unsettling place to work because you have, in a sense, things get challenged. So, for example, one of the things that we've found kind of interesting is to experiment with the outputs of research. So we've been using design fiction to try and imagine some of the slightly worrying futures that we might have in front of us. And I think those are the sort of things I think that may be a little bit harder to do if we were a pure social science research centre. Also, we can look at things like, for example, we just finished a project looking at the taxi service Uber. And clearly there, it's a technical advance, but something that has serious implications for the livelihood of taxi drivers around the world. So that needs the work of social scientists to understand it. And if one wants to intervene and not just be a passive observer of such things, then we've been exploring the role of designers in making perhaps more equitable systems to support shared mobility. But I want to talk today about our work on sensors. And like the keynote address earlier, I'm going to mention this fact that so many of us have these smartphones in our hands and in our pockets. And some of you might have seen this little dot that you get at the bottom of those devices. Now, I wonder, how many of you know what that dot is? It's the microphone. And at any time, that microphone can be on and can be recording. And when I was teaching, when I used to teach this work, I used to ask students, I said, would you consent to having everything you say and where you are being tracked at all times? And of course, then afterwards I would say, and how many of you have a mobile phone in your pocket? We're all carrying around these little sensors, and these sensors, I think, are interesting and have a little control, perhaps, that we actually have over them. So there's going to be sort of three parts to this talk. First, I'm going to ask a little bit about what you might think a sensor is. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about why, as social scientists, we should care. In particular, I'm going to talk a little bit about how sensors can invite new research methods. And then last, I'm going to return to some of the questions I think Nigel so nicely framed at the beginning there around the ethics of sensing. But I am going to go back to my PhD, which I did with Nigel, I think nearly 20 years ago. And one of the reasons why I'm here is that Nigel invited me to come and talk. And what do they say? They say that do you ever move away from your PhD? I guess it's one of those things that always stays occupied in some part of your mind. And having Nigel invite me made me think about this when I was putting this talk together. And my PhD was about forms. It was about things like this. This is a kind of, these sort of forms which have gaps in them that get filled in. This was a friend who found this. Her mother had passed away, and she found this in her archive of documents. It was a charge report for a demeanour conducted while serving national service. And if you're of a certain age, you'll remember the time when these forms and forms like this really kind of guided our world in lots of ways. That they had this sort of structure that you would find for all sorts of bureaucratic procedures and other such procedures. You'd have to complete forms of that sort. And my PhD was about trying to understand a little bit about what was changing when those forms were increasingly computerized. Now, I did the PhD. I don't think anyone was really that interested in it. To be honest, I went on to do some other things. Because forms, they don't make the heartbeat race, but they are obviously this kind of sort of fibre, fundamental fibre of bureaucracy and modern life. And it's been nice to see, at least I think, that the sort of sociology of documents since then has gone into sort of a field in its own right. One really lovely book, a recent book, is Lisa Geitelman, who did this book called Paper Knowledge. And she, in that book, has a history of the printers who actually produced these forms of this sort. And she writes, and there's quite a nice point she makes there. She says, job printers are a bit like locksmiths. While locksmiths are supposed to facilitate and ensure value in situ under lock and key, job printers facilitate the pure exchange function. And if you think about things like checks, I mean, I guess we don't use checks anymore, but checks were these kind of formal forms that, as well as being a bureaucratic thing, they actually had a sort of authority to them as well. Blank forms offer a glimpse into the incidental everyday occasions on which the authority of pointedness was and is continually produced, deployed, tested, reconfigured, and reaffirmed. And it's nice to think, isn't it? That, I think this is really nice work to look historically at the way that the growth in documents and forms of these sorts goes alongside the kind of march of modernity in different ways. In her work, she goes on and talks a little bit about what forms do. And I imagine many of us have a certificate, something like this, in our cupboards somewhere. And think about how this and the university diploma as a form, how it validates. If you didn't pass, you don't get to have that form. How it structures, where it was and when it was conducted. How it constrains what can be done, what can be considered valid for the diploma. And of course, how it can authenticate. And when you have to go for a job occasionally, but perhaps only occasionally, you have to produce the original document. Now, you might think this is all kind of historical importance, and perhaps a little bit it is. But actually, every day you fill in a form. Because I think probably, if you're anything like me, every day you find yourself looking at this. And of course, that's a form, isn't it? And to fly over here, I had to book flights, and of course I had to use this website with its own form as well, with its own fields to be completed and its own order to be put onto my journey and how I wanted that journey to be organised. But of course, now we have something that goes way beyond perhaps the power of these paper documents, because behind them is a database. And I quite like this quote from Lev Malovich, who talks about how, in his review of different kind of cultural forms, maybe one may be a little bit sceptical if there's such a thing as a primary cultural form, but anyway, he writes that the database is the primary cultural form of the 21st century, in the same way the novel was in the 19th and the film in the 20th. And it certainly seems to think that the way that the database in different ways undercut a lot of the work that I've seen presented here so far. So I was interested in forms on computers, forms everywhere now, seem to be everywhere now. But how does this get back to sensors? And how does it get back to these sensors that we're carrying around with ourselves? Well, I would argue that sensors are forms plus automation. Because it's easy to focus when you think of sensors on all this lovely rich data that they capture, but actually they're doing the same thing that forms are doing. Validating, structuring, constraining, and authenticating. And in different ways, they work to regularize our data before we even get to it. And I think it's interesting to think about how they go about doing that. Because even sensors, which can seem very broad in what they capture, can do these can do these same kind of mechanisms. One obvious one to think about is video, and this is a police camera. It's a wearable police camera, and in recent years, of course, these have been a site of some controversy because they've enabled and in some cases hindered debates around the behaviour of police and their interactions with the public. And of course, one has to remember that while they at least make possible moves of social justice, again, the same mechanism beats at their heart as sensors. And that can then also work in a counter move. One of my favourite papers is by colleague Chuck Goodwin, who did some work on the Rodney King trial, and that was maybe an early case of where public video that had been taken of a beating, of a police beating, was used in court. And in his work on it, he showed how, and of course the officers were ultimately let off, and they weren't charged in that, were convicted in that case. And he talks about how, even though you have something like video, which you can think of as being kind of relatively open, actually can be constrained from being shown from particular angles. It can be annotated, talked over, slowed down, such as to represent something that at first viewing might seem like essentially a punishment beating, but can be seen as regular police work. And indeed, if we look at the history of recent history of police cameras, it seems that precious few convictions of police officers have actually been carried out, even though the videos at first watching are often shocking and seemingly difficult to dispute. I should also mention as well, if you've got the time that again that these sensors, not just video sensors, can constrain and start to produce ourselves in interesting ways. If you have an iPhone and you can follow the patience of this, you can skip through in the settings of your phone, and you might be surprised to find out that the phone has categorized everywhere you go. In the background, it records all your locations and puts them in a list of all the places that you go to regularly. If you want to lose friends, it's an interesting thing to do with their phones without them knowing it. Okay, how long have I got now, Joe? I've got till...
You've certainly got another 10 minutes.
Excellent, okay, so it should be. So now let's move on a little bit to the second bit I want to talk a little bit about, which is how we can use sensors in social research. And as you can imagine, by talking about video, I've been using video over the last few years to try and record our interactions, particularly with technology, but actually more broadly. And I've been using wearable cameras to do what I've kind of loosely called everyday life recordings, which is to record for weeks at a time in some cases, to try and record the different sorts of data that you could get from of people's lives. Now, one of the early projects that I did on this was being in a research centre that was partly funded by mobile phone companies. We were very interested in people's interaction around the phone, so we instrumented them with cameras and recorded what was going on the screen on the phone, and we set them off for a day, 8 or 9 hours, and then recorded what they were doing using a technology not so different from these cop cameras that I mentioned earlier. And you get things that look a little bit like this. Now, video is often quite difficult to see when you sort of see it on the screen like this, but I just wanted to give you the flavour for the kind of materials, different camera angles, and this really enabled for us a chance to look really closely at things like how maps were being used on the phones, because you turn out, I don't know if you do this with them, but I do this with my phone, twisting it around, trying to work out what the correspondence is between this unusual world you find yourself in, say Bath, and what's going on the phone. And I think this was kind of interesting, but we wanted to take it a little bit further. So in our second study, we got rid of the cameras and we just had software running on the phone that recorded the audio round the phone and the phone screen. And we had it run on our participants' phones for a couple of weeks. So we captured everything, all the audio and all the video that was going on the screen. See maybe where the ethics start to come in here. So then they had to go online and they had to approve all the video clips that they wanted to share with us. And so you end up getting kind of data a little bit like this, screens, but you also get kind of what people are saying at the same time.
Just search me out. Is it by the station? Is it good? It's not even 1 mile. 4 minutes. Done.
So again, getting into these little slices of people's lives. At this point, they're in a restaurant. They're going off to a shisha place, I think, and they're talking about like where to go. And so we record the audio around what they're doing. And this gets us into a very strange place because we're recording whenever they're using their phone. And while the participants did approve every clip they shared with us, we ended up with data that was unsettling. People in bed. Nigel mentioned that scenario, and doing ordinary sort of talk you do at the end of the day when you're in bed. I mean, I've done quite a bit of ethnographic work in my time, but I've never managed to get into the same bed as anybody I was researching. Also difficult in emotional ways as well. In one case, a participant had lost a friend, had died, and then was composing the text message telling the group of friends that the person had died. I felt very uncomfortable about this. It turns out that the participant was very adamant that we should have access to this data, and indeed, for its emotional weight, it opened up, at least in research terms, something for us that we hadn't really kind of engaged with. So we kind of take this method further. We did some recent work, again, using these sort of wearable cameras. As I say, we do work in a centre that does a lot of work on technology research. So in this case, where we're looking at the use of these Apple Watches, and so we've collected similar sort of data, looking at different ways in which kind of people are interacting around this, and happy to talk about that later. It's quite interesting data, if anything, just from the unusual camera angles that you end up with. And to just mention again about these aspects, that, we have these validate, structure, constrain, authenticate going on with the way in which we're doing stuff with this video. We drop out people who don't collect enough data. We have this particular visual field that we focus on. We have particular constraints on when the participants might choose to start and stop the video. And of course, there is a certain authentication that goes on from presenting this kind of data. We always want to push things further to get ourselves more unsettled. And this is in some recent work we've been building these little sensor packs that we can put in public places that record continuously the audio of what's going on, say in a public place, and then broadcast it over the internet. So then we can use machine learning techniques on that to recognize what's going on. And if you're not terrified by now, you should be. Because of course, what on earth are we going to bug public places? So we've built these sensors, and we found ourselves in a kind of a bit of a bunch of ethical quandaries. I mean, originally we'd actually built these sensors to do simply pedestrian flow measurements. We were interested in, we're doing some work on national forests and looking at people travelling through the forest. And we thought this was a nice way. But then we realised with this sort of data, we could start to look for words that were being spoken. Perhaps we could do sentiment analysis or even political, look at the political views that are being expressed in different places. Now, I should emphasise we haven't put these out in public. Actually, as it happens in Sweden, there's no direct law that would stop us doing that, but certainly, of course, we're very unsure ethically about how to proceed. And this, of course, connects with the increasing abilities, although one must say, perhaps a little bit more constrained than our imaginations might go to, in being able to recognise and categorise this kind of data. We got these sensors working in terms of telling the difference between animals and humans, for example, walking past a sensor. But with image recognition, it is possible to do really quite narrow but interesting things. And one absolutely terrifying thing that's been happening lately has been people using cameras in public places and then running those faces that they detect through essentially the Russian version of Facebook to detect people who are in that public place. I'm really quite terrifying, this idea that these things will open up. And of course, that's an interesting place to be for research, isn't it? But we should perhaps scare ourselves a little bit to understand what's going on. Doesn't mean necessarily we do these things. And so, what kind of ethics do we have when we're recording these? In the first cases, when we're recording individuals, but then when we're thinking about the groups that these people are in, the public settings they're in, and then of course public space. One reference I found incredibly useful for this is, and it's quite well known in the privacy literature, is Nissenbaum's work on context relative informational norms, which is quite a mouthful, but actually I think gives us a way of thinking a little bit more about how we might want to move away from having blanket decisions about what we do in different situations where there's ethical questions. And Nissenbaum's, I think, very good in opening up to the idea that in all sorts of settings, the context has such a large involvement. It's why we have a jury system and not just judges deciding on things. We have to think about the context of different things. Another resource I found very useful. I don't know if you've seen this book by Karl Schneider about the censor's hand, which is really quite damning critique of the role of institutional review boards, and in fact, as you spoke about earlier, some of the ways that informed consent has been misused over the years. But if I can end on this point, I think that these aren't just social science ethics. These are ethics as these devices and these capabilities are in our hands in different devices. They go beyond just being social science issues, although important though that is, to questions about who and what would we record in our everyday life. Not just the legal constraints on those things, but the difference, for example, between companies recording our phone calls, between your questions, if there are any, being recorded in a room like this, actually without my consent, but anyway. Actually, no, that's not true, I did consent actually. But sometimes without consent. And then also, of course, we might find that a little bit different about recording a conversation with a friend without their consent, or indeed their consent might actually add extra complications to it. And then again, I think Nissenbaum is one really powerful resource to help engaging with that. Okay, so I've kind of touched on these three things in this talk. Firstly, I like to see sensors as being this forms plus automation, and I think that the work that's been done on the sociology of documents can help us understand what's going on here. And in particular, I think emphasize these four different ways in which sensors already structure the world. And lastly, when we want to really engage, I think, with the ethics of these things, I very much think that we have to think about the context and how many of these questions really are very context relevant when we want to decide what we think would be acceptable and what we wouldn't. Okay. Thank you.